Freedom Riders cross into Mississippi. The game founded in a peach basket turns sour as a lemon. The Prince and Princess of Monaco grace White House.
The court case of Plessy v. Ferguson was a decision made in 1896 by the U.S. Supreme Court that upheld the constitutionality of the separate but equal doctrine. This resulted in strict Jim Crow laws and separate public accommodations on interstate travel such as railroads and buses, but also in hotels, restaurants, schools, and theaters. In 1946, the court case Morgan v. Virginia, caused by an attempt to place Irene Morgan, a black woman, at the back of the bus, gave rise to the U.S. Supreme Court decision that ruled Virginia's law of racial segregation on interstate buses to be unconstitutional. However, this segregation was still occurring. On April 19, 1947, a bus ride through the southern United States was taken to challenge desegregation laws. There were 16 people on this bus, in which 8 were African American and 8 were white. This became known as the Journey of Reconciliation and is dubbed the first Freedom Ride. The members of this ride were, however, arrested, and in May of 1947 they were eventually sentenced. Because of this, the Journey of Reconciliation didn't end up having an effect on segregation laws regarding interstate travel.
In order to challenge segregation in the United States, a student activist group called the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, decided to produce their own protest movement through the interstate bus system. After the initial decision to start the rides, CORE set out to prepare and plan for the trip. The plan was to ride with 13 people starting in Washington, D.C., and going through Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and finishing in Louisiana. The Freedom Riders would be fighting the Deep South through nonviolent protests. They prepare by simulating expected situations. James Zurich, one of the only white Freedom Riders, worked in civil disobedience workshops, giving the protesters verbal abuse that they would expect on their trip. On May 4, 1961, the first Freedom Ride set out on the road. By the time the buses arrived in South Carolina, violent retaliation had already begun from white Southerners. Only halfway through their trip, 3 protesters, Genevieve Hughes, John Lewis, and Al Bigelow, were hurt by police officers. Violence continued throughout the trip at bus terminals and other stops. On May 15th, Mother's Day, the Freedom buses were attacked by a KKK member group in Anniston, Alabama. The group broke windows, violently beat the riders, and set the bus on fire. In addition, the riders taking refuge from their long trip at Ralph Abernathy's First Baptist Church in Alabama were once again surrounded by a violent white mob. The National Guard was soon called in by Attorney General Kennedy to stop the mob. The rides continued despite the International Criminal Court, ICC, cracking down on segregation. They finally ended when ICC made segregation illegal in November of 1961.
Devastations endured during the Freedom Rides, the violence, the arrests, the fires, and more, were documented town by town through photographs and narrative descriptions that were shared nationally through television and radio broadcast. These more developed forms of media in the 1960s were used to cover other events during the time frame to show proper recognition. The recording of the Apollo 11 moon landing asserted America's position in the space race. Journaling of the events in the Vietnam War incited protests throughout the nation. The documentation of the Kennedy assassination brought the citizens of the United States together as they all mourned the fatal loss of their president. Amongst all that, an uproar of advertising techniques for consumers trained America to become a society that listens to the media, which helped the cause of the Freedom Riders. Mass communication forms like television, radio, and other broadcasts spread the violence. Photographs captured protesters with their signs, fires set on buses, and civilians being arrested by the police. The Freedom Rides were one of the first civil rights movements that was spread worldwide and acknowledged, simply due to the implication of communication. Footage of a burning bus in Anniston, Alabama, photographs of beatings at the Birmingham bus station, shots of Freedom Rider James Peck lying in a hospital bed with a bandaged face, and so much more shocked the nation. These images brought words of brutality into reality for the American public, bringing home the segregationist regime in the South. News reporters stayed on the scene of the Freedom Rides, analyzing the events for their audience in depth while keeping them up to date with future plans for protest. Not only did this gain more support for the movement, but it also established their credibility and passion to the rest of the nation. William Barbie, one of the riders, told a reporter, As soon as we've recovered from this, we'll start again, proving the strength and resilience behind the protesters. As more and more people supported the rides, especially Northerners, there were more media coverage. This satisfactory phenomenon wasn't present with their inspiration, the journey of reconciliation, given that the Freedom Rides topped it in numbers and support, all due to the spread of their movement. The concept of communication influenced the Freedom Rides to the extent where, without it, they wouldn't have been the success they were.
As a result of the movement and the communication that sponsored the movement, the Freedom Rides were able to gather large sympathetic audience. National media outlets such as Time Magazine and Life Magazine featured the Freedom Rides and countenance of violence in their coverages, which thereby stimulated a feeling of empathy within the audience. And because of these coverages, the Freedom Riders, who started out with 13, ended up with 436 people, all who pressured the Interstate Commerce Commission to prohibit segregation. Although many whites were still against the movement, the Freedom Riders were able to strengthen their credibility throughout the U.S. and inspire others to take part in their civil rights. We can see this on February 12, 1965, when a group of students from Sydney, Australia performed their own civil rights movement and partake of the Freedom Riders in the United States. Therefore, without the media, the Freedom Riders wouldn't have been able to reach a large audience. Finally, after 3 years of pressuring Congress to eliminate segregation in public places, the Freedom Riders were heard. In 1963, Jonathan F. Kennedy proposed the legislation of the Civil Rights Act, which would then be signed into law by Lyndon B. Johnson, Kennedy's successor. By taking everything into account, media and communication played a pivotal role in the Freedom Riders' accomplishments. Therefore, without communication or media, the Freedom Riders movement wouldn't have been as strong as it was then.
If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content